Yeah, we are live now. Over to you, Venkat.
Okay, I'm just going to give it a minute and then I'll start things. Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening to everyone and good morning to you, Doug. Thanks so much to everyone for being here. My name is Venkat Srinivasan. I'm a member of the Oral History Association of India, and it's on behalf of the association and everyone at the conference, I welcome you to this public talk titled Oral Histories and Digital Lives, a conversation with Doug Boyd. There's so much that we've been discussing around digital lives and digital age over the last, I'm going to guess 30 years, and Doug can correct me if I'm wrong, and it could probably be even broader, that it seems what's there to say, but every time you look at it, there's a certain nuance, there's a certain addition, there's a certain different way in which things have changed. I was just reading the Oral History Reader the other day, which the one that came out, I think the edition that came out in the 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. And I was just looking through some of the conversations that were there in that. And just in the last 20 years of what's been said in that and what is there today is sort of very vastly different. So we're really delighted and honored, to be honest, to have Doug here to have a chat with us. I feel quite silly, to be honest, to try and introduce him to all of you, because all of you have really seen his work, heard his work, seen the work that they've done through the Louis B. Nunn Center. But I'll try and be brief around introductions, and I'd really like to have Doug sort of share his views on things. Before I go into that, just to give you some perspective on how this will be structured, we'll start with a very short introduction. I will then, sort of prompt Doug around a few questions and ideas, and we can obviously take this in certain directions, but it'll be lovely really to have a conversation with all of us here. So we'll try and keep this short and, hopefully have a larger audience interaction for about half an hour to 40 minutes towards the end, if that's okay with everyone. So Doug Boyd, who's here today, is the director of the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries. He is known worldwide for his pivotal role in how we have thought about oral histories, the digital age. As many of you, of course, know, he also steered the development of the Oral History in Digital Age website, which is hosted on the Michigan State University's platform. And we can put the link here. And if you haven't seen it, just encourage you to definitely check it out. It's been a tremendous resource, at least I can speak for myself, over the last many years. He has, of course, also steered the development of the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, which is out of his center, a tool that I would say is widely used really across hundreds of centers, perhaps, in dozens of countries. And these numbers are probably growing every year. I would say it's probably fair to say that the way people say the way you say, when you're searching for something, you're Googling, I would say it's reasonable to say that you can ask whether an interview has been ohms yet, if I can sort of use the verb for ohms. Doug is also the co-editor of a book, Oral History and Digital Humanities, Voice, Access, and Engagement. He runs a blog, Digital Omnium, Oral History, Archives, and Digital Technology. He's also a co-host of various podcasts, including the Wisdom Project podcast, which I really encourage people to check out, and the Saving Stories radio program. Previous to this, Doug Boyd managed the digital program for the University of Alabama Libraries. He served as a director of the Kentucky Oral History Commission. And prior to that, he worked as a senior archivist for the Oral History Collection at the Kentucky Historical Society. And I'm not even going to talk about his work and career as a musician today. But all said and done, it's an extraordinary body of work over many years of what I would say of listening, interpreting, making oral histories accessible, and most important, perhaps, making all of us listen. So thank you, Doug, so much for being here, and especially for being here bright and up, right early in the morning today. Thank you.
Thank you for the invite. I'm very honored. I have to say I am a little bit sad. So my daughter's up, it's the morning here, first thing, and my daughter's getting ready for school. And I said, have a good day at school. I'm going down to my office and for my lecture. And she says to me, have fun in India. And I had this moment where I thought, oh, I'm doing this remotely. And, the thing that Indira and I have been talking about for years is somehow getting me to India. And so that's sort of on the dream list of places to visit. So it's just a little sad that I'm not physically there with you all to speak, but this is good. This is good. And I'm excited, but yeah, I wish I was there in person.
Yeah, we all do really, but hopefully, fingers crossed, we're able to invite you over in person, and as soon as things improve, and things do seem to be improving, at least on the COVID front. So the word digital, as I started to say, we can look at it in various phases, and I think the questions and the conversation that we'll have will probably be structured around four sort of ideas. So looking at digital in the creation of the record, in the storage of the record, in access to the record, but perhaps more broadly in all of them put together in the meaning making that we go about, and how the lives that we live are so digital. So I'd be curious to understand a little bit about these perspectives. But before we dive into it, I thought in this audience it might be nice for everyone to just get a sense of the landscape of what's happening at the Nunn Center, and because I'm not sure, when I started to browse through it, I've been humbled before, but this is quite astonishing. So I'd love if you can just give us some perspective over the last, say, 10 years or so of your time there, or more actually, of how things are at, what's accessible, what's the volume, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, the Nunn Center has been not always called the Nunn Center, but at the University of Kentucky, we have been recording oral history for 49 years. Next year will be our 50th year. We were part of the movement that really swept the United States in the early 1970s, where it just got wildly popular after the cassette really made it easier for people to record oral history. So academic institutions like mine started to create oral history centers, and a lot of them sort of then went away, but several of them have stayed and have thrived, and we are one of those. But, I came to the Nunn Center in 2008 to begin as the director. And until then, the emphasis really was completely on interviewing, just interview and collect as much as you can possibly collect. Really very little attention had been paid towards access to the collection at that point. We had very few of our interviews digitized. There was really no public access point that was that made the collection broadly accessible. Even the records, just the records of what we had, was something that was very difficult to get. And so before I came to the Nunn Center, I had been an archivist for oral history for several years. I directed something called the Kentucky Oral History Commission, and then I did go to the University of Alabama to direct the digital program for the library. And I started really thinking during that 2-year period about usability and web usability specifically. And it just, something clicked in my mind that I just got really frustrated with the fact that people were really struggling, I think, to provide access to oral history. And Mike Frisch, the famous Mike Frisch, had been talking a great deal about things with regard to enhancing access through indexing specifically. But when I came back to oral history from Alabama, and I stepped into that collection and that work, I really started to grapple with this frustration that oral history seemed to be the hardest thing in the archive to make accessible. And so it was the last collection that anybody, or the archivists, wanted to process. So access was very limited to oral histories in general. And I think that's something that has driven me substantially in the last 14, 15 years, is this real focus on how can we make it easier and more effective to provide access to oral history. And so when I arrived at the Nunn Center in 2008, we had about 6,000 interviews. Again, we had been collecting since 1973. I did count it yesterday. As of yesterday, we're at 15,777. So it took us from 1973 to 2008 to get 6,000 interviews, but now we're close to tripling in size, very close. In fact, I just picked up an oral history collection of 700 interviews last week, and so that number is not reflected in the number that we have. And I'm so excited about the collection that we brought in. But we don't just collect archival interviews. We do partner very actively now. I think that's something that came out of my experience as the director of the Kentucky Oral History Commission, because part of that was creating partnerships. And so the majority of our interviews that are conducted, our interviewing projects, are indeed partnership type of projects. I've got a very limited small staff of 2 or 3 archivists now. And I have really only one person on staff who is interviewing full time. But last year we brought in about 1,200 new interviews. And I think over the last 5 years have been averaging about 750 to 800 new interviews each year. And that is because we've established all of these partnership projects. So we have maybe, I did count again yesterday, I think it's 52 active interviewing projects happening right now. Now, obviously, because of COVID, most of those are remote interviewing projects, but there are some in-person interviewing projects happening right now. So while we started to ramp up and accelerate the interviewing initiatives, it really became clear that we needed to enhance access. And so following another stream, I created this OHMS thing, designed OHMS, the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, which, if you're not familiar with it, originally in 2008, 2009, did one thing and one thing only. It basically took a transcript, and when you searched on a word in the transcript, it would then take you with a click to the moment when somebody says the word in the audio and the video player. The idea was the orality of this experience was being lost. There was so much focus on transcription, but people weren't being encouraged to listen because it actually is very hard to listen. It's an inefficient process. And the example that I always give is the cassette. So there's a few of you here that probably grew up listening to audio cassette, and as the primary way we consumed music, and that was me. I just looked to find one so I could hold it up just as a prop. I don't seem to have one. But if you remember how difficult it was when your favorite song was on side B, and in the middle, how you actually found that music efficiently was very cumbersome and inefficient. You know, you'd stop, you'd play, you'd listen, try to figure out, is this the song I want? No, this isn't the song I want. Where does the song I want fit on the order? And then you'd forward, rewind, forward, play. Oop, almost there. Rewind, play. And then you get to hear your song. And I think that was part of it, was this very analog mindset. Even though we were in a digital environment in 2008, heavily, photograph collections were being searchable and made super efficient to look at and to search. Newspaper collections, anything textual based and paper based seemed to be doing fantastic in a digital environment, but oral history was really struggling. It was still very analog, and people were still saying to me when they would ask for collections, oh, just send me the transcript. And if they were lucky enough to have a transcript, because very few of our interviews, relatively speaking, are actually transcribed, I would say, well, you've got to listen to it too, just to make sure, because the transcript could be wrong. And I have been focused on this idea of the interview recording being the thing, as opposed to the interview transcript being the thing. Now, knowing full well that the interview transcript is by far the most efficient way for human beings to interact in some ways, at least until I think we kind of made the turn with the indexing aspects of what OHMS does. And I think it was about 2011 that I implemented the indexing feature. Again, Mike Frisch had been talking about indexing for some time. He had developed a tool that was called Interclipper, but he actually didn't develop that tool. It was a tool that he sort of found that somebody had developed and kind of repurposed for oral history in a brilliant way. And he had written extensively about indexing. But in order to use the tool, you really had to, it was a local tool, so you had to be physically there at the computer terminal where the tool was installed. And in order to create your material for the tool, you were going through Mike at the time. And so there was really not a broadly accessible. Oh, and the Shoah Foundation had created an indexing technology that they had showed at conferences. And I remember seeing that, but again, it was made for only them. Like only the Shoah Foundation could use the tool that they had created. So there really wasn't a broadly accessible tool to help with indexing. And if you're not familiar with indexing, basically the idea is to create metadata at the story level, the segment level that we all know in oral history that there are major subject changes, and usually those major subject changes are prompted by a question by the interviewer. And so as you're listening, they might be talking about childhood, and so you can title that segment with childhood. You can create a partial transcript. You can do any keywords or subjects that you want to put in there. You can write a synopsis. You can put in GPS coordinates. So if somebody's talking about the town where they grew up, you can actually click and it interfaces with Google Maps. And so you can see that place on the map. And you can also have a hyperlink associated or multiple hyperlinks associated with that segment, which can pull in photographs, for example, or link out to a website. And so we found that we could do an index, which again, if you're coming from the analog age, which I kind of bridged, we used to do this with paper and pencil or pen, and the cassette counter numbers. We would write, at counter number 307 talks about career. That was one. There's been multiple ways that we tried to make analog more efficient. So it was really that similar paradigm that we developed the indexing technology, and the indexing really took off because we found we could do it far more efficiently than transcription. And my center did not have a budget to transcribe everything we recorded or brought into the archive. And so this became a way that we could find where we could enhance access and discovery of the collection, even though we didn't have transcription. And then we got a wonderful grant from an organization here in the United States called IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, that allowed us to take this great tool that we created and make it open source and free. And I think it was 2014 that we really released it onto the world. And it took a fairly lengthy amount of time for it to catch on, but because it requires you to kind of rethink how you prepare your material in the archive. We had been doing it for years, so we had already pivoted, but I think that's something that is pretty substantial for other archives to do. So it's taken a while, but I think now, again, I peeked in yesterday just to get the numbers straight, and it's now being used in 62 different countries. And I think there's yeah, well over 1,000 institutions using it. And it was designed in a way that it could be a major university program that has major IT staff, or it could be a graduate student who's hosting a website themselves. That student can enhance access in the exact same way as the major university archive with OHMS. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it really took off. And then I think in 2018, no, 2000, I think 2016 was when we actually added a bilingual component to it. So you can actually index in 2 languages, and you can upload a transcript and a translation. And that I think is an exciting development, because we live in a global world now, and I want my material to be discoverable in multiple languages. Again, it's not artificial intelligence that's creating that language. OHMS is really assuming you have something and you upload it or you create it using OHMS. But that's what we've been starting to engage with, is the artificial intelligence aspects of automatic speech recognition, text mining, to kind of start to automate metadata creation and things like that. But all the while we're doing this, we're trying to do all these other oral history projects too. So we're running in parallel streams to not only continue to collect, but and record important oral history interviews and projects in a much larger scale. But we're also ramping up the access, transitioning to video. We're transitioning a lot to video recording lately. And when I say a lot, I'd still say, now let's subtract out COVID, because remote interviews are, a lot of those are video, but that's a different kind of video that we're talking about when we talk about, say, the studio quality documentary style interviews. But those kind of video interviews are extremely difficult to preserve. They're very large files. And so we've had to really innovate and adapt on our digital preservation side as well, to make sure we're responsibly taking care of the material that we're creating, or that we're agreeing with a partner that we will preserve forever. So we've had to really innovate on the digital preservation side, which we don't talk a whole lot about in the public sphere, but that's where a lot of our focus is how do we take this massive amount of data. And I think it was really interesting, because I think we can fit all of 1973 to 1999 on one 10 terabyte server partition. But like the year 2000, 19 or 2018 or 19, when we were doing a lot of studio interviews at the Nunn Center studio on video, we don't even fit the whole year on that one 10 terabyte server partition. So that's a challenge that I think we're working with greatly as well. And I think one of the things we'll talk about too, as we're getting in, the Nunn Center is ahead of the curve and has been ahead of the curve on the access side of things at our scale, but we're also ahead of the curve in the privacy issues that are starting to emerge. And I know that's on the list of things we're going to talk about. That's something I spend a great deal of my time also thinking about is that. But, we, committed back to like your original question in the Nunn Center. And, we are a very small staff. So everything that I do is about how can we be efficient, and, how can we also create, if we're creating a tool, it's going to be a free tool that's going to lift everybody up. And I think I'm quite pleased at that. I think this other, we created some plugins for OHMS to work really seamlessly with a platform called Omeka, which is a popular digital exhibit or repository framework that's also open source and free. That little, when we made those plugins freely available, we'd been using Omeka for a couple of years, but when we made those plugins freely available, there seemed to be a lot of people who are sort of completing the circle. I think that completed the circle, because you can use OHMS, but OHMS still requires a platform for you to host all of your interviews on, and Omeka does that. And so now we really, by making it easy and free for people to implement Omeka and OHMS together, an enormous percentage of people are starting who are asking for new OHMS accounts are actually asking for that, because it really is an instant repository that you have created. And with the plugins, I can, if you had mentioned the verb OHMS, we have OHMSed, maybe 6,000 interviews of our collection. But if you've OHMSed your oral history collection, I can create that Omeka site using the OHMS plugins in maybe 20 minutes. And it could be hundreds of interviews. It doesn't matter, because they automatically import from OHMS into Omeka. And so I can have an entire repository searchable if you've already OHMSed the material in about 15, 20 minutes. And so that I think is another turn where we can really not just make it better user experience, which OHMS does, but enhance that ability to manage a collection and create that discovery experience for people. And I'll finish off by saying, I just finished counting up the numbers for last year. So I have all these statistics. And last, when I got there in 2008, maybe 200 interviews would actually get used every single year. Last year for 2021, it was 231,000 interviews were accessed last year, which is just astonishing to me. And when you think about that in a kind of big way in terms of where we've come from oral history standpoint, where we couldn't get people to listen to our stuff. I mean, it was really, hard to get people to actually use oral history in the archive. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say it's almost too many, but when you factor in some of those privacy issues, but we really are potentially, I think, introducing a factor that we really need to start talking about, because oral history is now going to be something that can be accessible to a mass audience. And so that has introduced a lot of things, I think, now that I've had to grapple with, but 231,000, interviews being accessed last year is really exciting for our little oral history center, which, I say little, but, we're not necessarily the biggest, but 15,000 is a lot of interviews, but to have that number of interviews get accessed is really exciting.
And the numbers just speak for themselves. That's what astonished me the first time. I think it's, to say that we have that many users, that you have that many countries, because I think at this point, what it also means for, and I really like the word that you used, or sort of the circle that you described about how it sort of completes the circle, especially with Omeka. And I wanted to talk about that later, but just to contextualize for the audience, at least the way I've sort of also spoken to students and such is to say, I mean, there's history and memory. Then there is the process of collecting or talking to someone, listening to them. Then there's a process of trying to figure out a way to store it. Then there is the process of interpreting it. That is the indexing, the meaning making to some degree. And of course, archivists, and I'm an archivist in my current avatar, and some archivists may sort of push back on the idea of saying whether archivists should be meaning makers, and we can talk about that at some other point. But then after that comes the process of actually developing a narrative or a story. And most of us don't enter this world saying that we're going to become oral historians or recounters of our memories. We come into it because we latch onto a story and we just want to know what happens next. And in a way, I think what you guys have done with the linking of OHMS and Omeka, and Omeka for the audiences is, I don't know, I think I'm reducing its potential, but in one way it is an exhibition space. It's a space to be able to show your collections in a relatively efficient, easy way. And I apologize, Doug. I know it's a lot more than that, but
that's correct. That is correct. But it does that in the way it differentiates from, say, like a WordPress website is that it does it in a repository way. So right. It's a repository approach, and so your item has a record, and and that record can be then referenced by the exhibit builder and all these different things. And I think that's where it's different from just throwing up a website and putting a bunch of oral history on the website. It has that kind of repository back end.
Yeah, yeah. And I think so when you do this plugin, when you sort of complete that circle is, people are able to sort of see that chain of events that goes from a story all the way back to almost a collection of a record, or a collection of an interview. And in a way, it's almost like an unboxing where you're able to sort of see, there's a certain transparency to it almost, where you can see how something came to be. The reason I really like this is because it gets more people interested in the very idea of an oral history. And they say, well, looks like I should be doing a bunch of oral histories because now I can see what I can do with it. So there is also that sort of, opening up the landscape of who is conducting an interview. For instance, OHMS, as I think I've noticed, it's not only for institutions, individuals can go ahead and use it in some ways. But I did want to touch upon this point that, you've been very, clear about this idea of, and, you've referenced Mike Frisch, and this morning, Brunda in her talk also talked about, the line that he had described, I don't remember when the dirty little secret of the archives, which is of course talked about a lot, which is very true that, the collections are largely, not seen or heard by many people. At least that's how it used to be. And it perhaps, I would say, is still the case. And, even I'm part of an archive, and it's a small archive, and I would say many people don't know what's in this archive. And a lot of it, so the indexing is at the heart of this process. Making it accessible is about trying to say, okay, fine, how do you read the material? How can you add layers to it? And the origins of indexing to me are just very simple, right? I mean, in the sense that we're basically saying that you need to have a layer of time, you need to have a layer of content, which is what you would, handwriting in your cassette tapes in a sense, and what you're able to do digitally. And the end goal, in a sense, is to have a certain diversity of access, that you want more and more people to come to the archive. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your experiences of the kinds of users. And I had the good fortune of listening to a story that you guys had described of, I think, a user in Italy, if I'm not mistaken, who was looking for a particular story around a person who had moved to Italy during the World War. So I mean, there are lots of such stories, but one of the things that I'm curious about in this process is that as you diversify indexing, as you're able to make more and more people make sense of the material so that it can be seen by a third party, are you also thinking of crowdsourcing that process as well? Are you thinking of adding a layer where more and more people could add their interpretations, and what complications do you see into? So you can see we're slowly diving into the privacy question.
Yeah, you're right. Yes. Not slowly, that goes right into the privacy question. But I think that we'll get to that. I think the original question, the core of the original question was in some of the users, in terms of talking about the users. And I think that that's an interesting question that I grapple with greatly, because who are these 231,000, and to be clear, that basically is, what I get from digital analytics, or I'm sorry, Google Analytics, that basically is telling me, people from what country came and spent this much time on a record and such. You really get very little from that interaction. And in some ways, those 200 interviews, that I talked about in 2008 were much more substantive interactions, where somebody would pick up the telephone and call the archive and say, I'm working on this thing, and what do you have, and help me. And then we hang up, and I know that, I know how this person's using this interview. I know what the publication is. This sort of anonymous user out there is challenging, I think, for an archive. There's no doubt in my mind that we do have an acceleration of use in scholarly publications, because we do still say, if you're going to reproduce aspects of this interview, we'd like to know about it and require permission. Now, whether everybody asks for permission or not, probably not the case. But through that portal, so to speak, we're able to find out that, yes, we have an acceleration of usage in the scholarly domain. We also find that this explosion in popularity of podcasting has really been one of the more popular users, and our interviews are getting used in mainstream documentaries now. CBS News. CBS is one of the major networks, television networks here in the United States. In fact, before cable television, CBS was one of the big three networks. They just ran several of our oral histories on a national production on Martin Luther King Day, because my center happens to have interviews with civil rights leaders from 1964, including Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and some of the very high profile people. And so so that collection gets used a lot around Martin Luther King Day, but this was a major news network in the United States using this in a national forum. So those are happening, and we usually know about those. Video documentaries more and more are starting to use our material. Again, a huge, overwhelming percentage of our material is on audio, and so those documentary filmmakers sometimes get frustrated by that. But we are creating more and more video over the last 10, 15 years, 10, 12 years. And so, so those are interviews that are getting used widely and extensively. So we have some sense that, but interestingly enough, I think the overwhelming acceleration in terms of who's using our collection seems to be just individuals who have, an interest, or, so like we have a collection on the bourbon industry, several collections on the bourbon industry. Those interviews get used by people all over the world who are just interested in bourbon whiskey history and culture. And so those interviews get used. Our horse industry, Kentucky is very well known for its horse industry, especially here in central Kentucky. And those are interviews that get used extensively all over the world. But we have a collection of interviews with African immigrants to Kentucky. That was our number two accessed collection around the world last year, was our interviews with African immigrants. And I don't know why. We have sort of more high profile projects and collections, but it was this collection with African immigrants that rose to the top. And I think that's exciting to me, is then, we're serving some audience with this material. How can we figure out who that audience is, I think is going to be that's one of our frontiers, I think, and challenges on the archive side. But in terms of the users who are using them, I'm also getting more phone calls now very often from people who find those serendipitous moments where somebody says, I just want to thank you. This is, an interview with my grandfather, and I haven't heard his voice in 40 years. And you have an interview with him, and I didn't know this interview existed. And those are the calls that I think are really, for me, very gratifying, and indicative of the fact that we're able to reach a wider audience. If those individuals are discovering the material, which might have been, described as hidden away in an archive 10 years ago, then I think we're on the right track. I think if we're making our interviews accessible to those individuals who wouldn't necessarily be the ones who would go to an archive to search for something. So that's all happening. The story that you referenced, if people aren't aware of the story, I've told it a ton of times in some different forums, but there's a great YouTube video that tells this story. But a novelist from Italy in a very small town called Tremensuoli emailed us to request an interview, and that interview was with a gentleman named Marshall Webb, who happened to be in the military unit that was in that small town during World War II for a period. And the person requesting it said he was writing a novel, and he was looking for historic, he was writing a novel. That's all he told me, that was set during the war. And so I assumed he wanted to just hear somebody's experience from the American side of being in that town. And, I offered to provide, or I offered to look for any other interviews that we might have with individuals who had fought in that unit or been in that town. And normally all of us have done research on some level. normally the answer to that question will always be yes. You have more information for my project, please provide it. But his answer was, no, I'm not interested. Thank you. I just want this interview with Marshall Webb. To which I probably couldn't contain my curiosity and said, why are you just interested in this one interview with this individual? At which point he sends us a photograph of an alleyway in his small town, and then a close-up picture. And that close-up picture shows that Marshall Webb, the person we interviewed in 1986, had carved his name in the wall during one of the battles in this alleyway. And this person was writing this book, walked past it and thought he'd do some Google research, and came to our interview. And of course, it's a 3.5-hour interview that largely isn't about his experience in that town. But there's about a 10-minute stretch in that interview where he's talking about his experience in that town. And because of OHMS, he can go right to that moment and listen to that part. And I think since we put that YouTube video out, so many people have gone over to that town and done rubbings of Marshall Webb's name, that they have actually put a sign on the wall next to his carved name, a plaque that sort of has his picture. And you can stand in that alleyway, and if you have a great international data plan on your phone, you can actually listen to that moment on your smartphone because of this discovery. And so I think that's really a great example, I think, of all the good that we have from this network connectivity. The flip side of that whole conversation is now the potential overexposure and over access that we might be experiencing with something that is maybe the most deeply personal thing somebody has, their life story. And suddenly every second of this person's interview that they conducted with you is now on a very different historical record and searchable, and potentially something that somebody could potentially misuse. Now that has always been the case. Somebody can always walk into an archive, listen to an oral history, and misquote that oral history in a scholarly journal that maybe 15 or 20 people would read and remember. But what has happened is the scale has changed and the pace has changed dramatically. And so now if somebody is potentially misquoting or misusing or quoting out of context a moment in an oral history interview, then it's open for the world very quickly.
Thank you. No, I love hearing that story, but also I think we're sort of segueing into the thing that I think we should really sort of spend some time discussing. That, I mean, we carry a digital persona of ourselves everywhere we go. I mean, I think that's just the way it is. And there is a person that we are when we're speaking face to face with someone, and there's a person that we are when we're texting someone or calling someone or emailing someone or talking to someone on Zoom. But what's happened, I think, this question of, when things are getting more and more accessible, I guess my curiosity is what happens when things are so widely available. And as an archivist, I'm always amused when people say we discovered something. Of course, I mean, this is what archivists say, that it was always there. It's just a question of layers of access. But I'm also reminded of what happened with Einstein's diaries a few years ago. I don't know if anybody remembers that, when I think it was finally translated into English, and then lo and behold, people found out that he made not so kind remarks about the people that he was seeing, I think, in East Asia. And so there was a flurry of articles about Einstein being a xenophobe, or I think there was something around misogyny. I have to see if I'm mistaken about this. But the point is, it was always there in the archive. And at some point it was finally translated, and then someone, a good press published it, and then it made it out. And so this will probably happen over and over again. So the afterlife in the sort of, widely accessible digital space, there are two questions around this that I wanted to ask you, which are sort of going to segue into privacy and ethics of making things so accessible. One is maybe just a practical question. How do you deal with situations when someone just says, when it becomes too public and they say, no, you know what, on second thoughts, I want to go back to being private. I don't like this public space for whatever reason. There is a variety of reasons. That's one thing. What are the, of course, archivists have to sort of comply with that, and that just makes sense. But where are, what is the line that one draws there? That's one. But the second is perhaps a more chillier scenario, if I can use that phrase, about triangulation of people's identities, using the metadata in these interviews of profiling based on what is being shared. And so you're able to sort of mine through it and sort of say, okay, fine, this can happen. And of course, it's not uncommon for it to, it seems in the realm of possibilities if it's not happened already. So, and in a way, I guess oral histories are front and center in this space if they are being made more and more accessible. I think about this a lot based on even the interviews that we have. And I don't have a good answer to this.
There is the scary answer to your question, and then there's the really scary answer to your question. I'll start with just the scary answer to your question, because we do have a lot of people who are starting to come to the archive and say, I knew it was going online, but I'm reassessing my privacy, and I would like you to take that down. So we just had an example of somebody who was in the military. She was involved in we had a project interviewing people who were in the military and deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and then they would come back and enroll in college. And we wanted to capture that story of transitioning, not just back into society after being in a combat situation, but transitioning into higher education. And beautiful project, a very powerful project. But she was one that I spoke to her a couple of years ago about this. But this was 10 years ago, but she emerged a couple of weeks ago and clearly has gotten a job in military intelligence and needs to take things down. And so we went through and took everything down from that. Now we couldn't do anything about what has already been potentially quoted from her interviews out there, but we can certainly take things down. One of my favorite stories was a person, we had a lot of dramatic stories where we have a project called Queer Appalachia. Appalachia is a mountain region here in Kentucky. It's very rural. And Queer Appalachia was interviewing LGBTQ individuals in small towns in this very rural location that's also very conservative politically and spiritually, so to speak. And so not a very tolerant necessarily. There is an incongruity there potentially that I think is a good, interesting project. Well, a lot of people talking very openly about their sexuality. We were very clear about, the public nature of the project. One individual was talking very candidly about his HIV status. And I think, 20 years ago, your HIV status was something that was a very guarded secret. But now, HIV has become a very manageable, potentially disease, chronic condition, so to speak. And at least here in the US, that's not the case elsewhere. But so he's very open about his HIV status. Well, he calls me one day, several years after the interview's been online, and wants the interview taken down. And it turns out he's applying for a new job, and our interview is number 2 on a Google search of his name. And, there's part of me that was like, number 2, we did it. Yes. And then there's the flip side that's like, oh, of course, we will take it down. So we have always restricted interviews from the long term for certain projects and certain people. Most politicians, we restrict their interviews during their lifetimes because we want them to actually be truthful and honest and open. And so a large part of our collection tends to be restricted during people's lifetimes. So I don't hesitate to put an archival restriction on those, if an interviewee asks me to do that is just no problem. I think the problem, and we discover so many issues through OHM's indexing. And I will say that's one reason why I love indexing with all of my heart, because a human being, is physically taking the moment to listen to an interview before we put an interview online. And if we were just transcribing the interview, especially now that we're in the age of automatic speech recognition, and throwing that transcript online, we wouldn't have caught an enormous amount of things. And I compiled this list for another presentation that I gave yesterday, but, we have somebody just, making a murder accusation, somebody talking about their own drug use, somebody talking about, just last week, we had somebody, talking about dealing drugs in a very unexpected way. We have people revealing sort of sexual activity with detail, like where they will say somebody's name, and implicate somebody else in that. We've got people talking about deep family secrets of abuse, and we got people talking about mental illness. I'm not talking about them talking about their own mental illness, because I'm okay with you talking about your own. It's when you talk about someone else's and you bring in this third party and make those kinds of revelations, so to speak, even if your intentions are really good. Somebody talking about, somebody's recovery from addiction, and you're being very proud of them. That could come up in an interview, but what you just did was reveal that person's addiction to the whole world, and without that person's consent. So I think there's a lot of that there that we started to realize as we're indexing. We need to do a better job, one, with informed consent, but we're still not there as an entire field. I think informed consent, I don't think we really are ready to truly explain the internet and its potential implications, because I don't think we know what that is yet as a society. But I know we can do a better job trying to find these moments. And so we instituted a pretty intense process. I'll put a link in the chat because everybody asks me for these questions, but I put together 6 questions in what I call informed accessioning. And informed accessioning, this is just the blog version of this article that I did. But informed accessioning was this idea that the archive wants to know if these moments exist. And so we have required everybody who does an interview that they're putting in the archive to answer these 6 questions. These 6 questions all boil down to one thing, and that is there something in this interview that we, the archive, need to know about? Is there something in this interview that if this were your story, you'd be perfectly fine having it go online on Tuesday? And that was somewhat effective, but we became clear that when we started indexing them, we were making even more discoveries that were making it past the interviewers who weren't filling out or answering the questions. And we were finding problematic content so we have implemented the second phase where the indexers ask those very same questions, looking for those potential issues in an interview. And we have really, I think, been able to adapt, I think, to have a more human focused and a more nuanced focus towards access. So we don't put anything online unless it's been very closely evaluated. And if there's a potential problem there, I mean, we're not censoring things. We might put restrictions on things or just simply choose to not put an interview online for right now. Every instance is treated as an individual. We don't have blanket policies for every interview, because it seems like every single instance of potentially problematic content is something that should be uniquely discussed. So we as a committee get together and talk about some of the issues and such, but we've really had to pivot and put an intense focus on the content of the interviews, and not just the broad content like archives typically do, but very specific moments, and making sure that those moments don't pose a risk. I think I feel better about where we've come from that point. I still don't think as a field we're doing a good job with informed consent, because I think as a society we're not doing a good job with understanding the implications of the internet and privacy. So oral history certainly is not going to outpace the rest of society, I think, in terms of that. But I think that the larger question that the final question that you asked is this idea of we've got this personal privacy risk. And I wish I had it here on this computer. I think it's on my laptop right now. But I have a slide that really, yeah, it's not on this computer, unfortunately, but I have a slide that really is quite good, because I basically took a very benign oral history interview with somebody who served in the Peace Corps. And I took the first 4 minutes or 5 minutes of that interview, and I took the text and I put it all on the slide, and I changed a little bit of the details. But then I highlighted in red every concept in that first 5 minutes of an interview that could pose a potential privacy risk. And the person talked about where they were born. The person talked about the elementary school that they attended as a child. They talked about their parents. They talked about their religion. You could infer that they had grown up in a city here in the States called South Bend, Indiana. And South Bend, Indiana is, has a major college there. And there were all these implications that you could draw from those first 5 minutes. And in the context of, like, say, the 2016 election here in the United States, where there was all this intense attention paid to Cambridge Analytica and the way that political campaigns were using and creating data points and from people's social media profiles. I think it was Cambridge Analytica that said they had something like 300 data points on every American voter, that could draw some conclusions, and that was very scary. But what they're doing is taking your social media profile, seeing that you post a picture of, the fact that you drive a Volkswagen car, and we're going to imply that or infer that you would be an Obama voter because you drive a Volkswagen and you listen to National Public Radio as opposed to Fox News. And so they create a profile based on these algorithms. Well, they're still guessing when they do that. But in an oral history interview, you're actually telling them what's important to you and and who you are. And so it's almost making the job more easy for them to triangulate and create. And so I could see an oral history interview being very useful to somebody who wants to create a custom marketing profile for you and what you love. And we've all experienced this, where you have those sort of conspiracy moments where you're talking about something, say with a spouse, and then within a few minutes, on Facebook, you get an ad that pertains to the thing that you were talking about. But we also have those moments where clearly, I am a musician, so and periodically want to purchase a new guitar, and I've been looking at new guitars. Now, every single time I go onto the web, I'm being hit with ads for the guitars, not just any guitar, but the guitars that I'm specifically looking at. So take oral history and insert that into the equation, where somebody could take several oral history interviews conducted with you, and really profile you from a nefarious perspective. And that I think is one of the scary scenarios. There's other scary scenarios with regard to oral history, but I think from that privacy standpoint, that is something that I think is something that the whole field really needs to grapple with, because with oral history, one of the things we love and consider to be a good oral history interview is the fact that it has detail. These are the details that weren't on the historical record. I mean, one of the reasons we all went into this business was to a lot of times interview the people who weren't extensively documented on the historical record. And I think that's something that we just really need to be thoughtful and mindful of, I think, as we proceed down this road. And we're trying to find that balance between continuing to do what oral history does best, but also being really mindful of the now and the potential implications. I feel so much more comfortable working with a project that we did in the 70s and putting it online, with potentially people who have been long gone, than some of these projects where we're interviewing somebody and that interview is going online in 2 weeks. 2 weeks after it goes into the archive. Certain projects, not all of our projects do that, just to be clear, but certain projects that are, say, high profile or have a funding driver behind it, that we'll get it into the archive, ohms it, and have it online within 2 weeks, and potentially. That's something that I think we all need to really think about. And there was an article in the Oral History Review several years ago that was pretty critical of ohms, and particularly targeted Mike Frisch and myself, I think. And there's a lot of good in that article. The article didn't actually ask me anything about what we're actually doing before we put things online, so it didn't consider all of the things that they don't see before we put an interview online, in terms of trying to create filters and being mindful and very deeply considering every aspect of the interview before it goes online. And I'm sure certain things have slipped through, and there are many, many things that we will just never be able to flag because we don't know what could potentially be a problem for people, because it is a very subjective process. But I think we're doing a pretty good job, I think, and have adapted pretty well. And I think there's certain ways that digitally you can, it's interesting because now I'm starting to think about implementing what's called a click-through. And the click-through basically is the thing that when an interview comes up, that you have to say, I accept these terms before you actually are presented with the interview. There's people who have started to implement that at other archives. And that's one way to kind of, in some ways, discourage the search engines from being too effective, which is really interesting, because I've spent the first part of my career trying to get the search engines to pay attention to all of this stuff that we've created, and have that I think could be transforming. And now we're talking about how can we limit them, which is really fascinating to me. And I think I've seen some things come in the chat, and I'm not looking at the chat either.
I haven't seen the chat either. I just saw like the number go up from 1, 2, and 3. But I think it's time to go into that. But before, I just want to sort of, move us up a little away from the doom scrolling that we've sort of found ourselves going into a little bit around the privacy. But I think, also, I mean, in the larger scheme of things, the biggest aspect of indexing and, what OHMS has done and what all of you have done is really sort of to make us listen carefully to the interview. You'd mentioned this, that no matter what this is forcing us to do is to sort of, go back to the orality that we've been discussing for so many decades, in a sense, but to really stay in the audio and stay and listen to someone. And if we're able to, if these processes take us in that direction, hopefully we'll be able to find the regulations to tackle the issues that have come up as a byproduct of that process.
I'm glad you returned us to the beauty of this process, and that is the beauty of what's happening is we're getting a lot of people who are listening. We didn't have a whole lot of people reading because we didn't have a ton of transcripts, but we're getting a lot of people listening. Indexing really does encourage that. Interestingly enough, we are sort of, the whole thing that makes indexing, I think, effective is you've introduced yes, it makes some searchability for an interview, but in OHMS, you can have both a transcript and an index. And in some ways, that's the best case scenario, because you get the nuanced search of, or the comprehensive search of a transcript in the keywords, but people can talk about living under segregation in the South for 3 hours and never once mention the word segregation. And if you're a researcher, you come into that interview, you're going to take a bunch of guesses to try and figure out, are they talking about what you want them to be talking about, to help you with your research. Whereas in indexing, within 20 seconds of looking at an index where you're presented with all the titles of each segment, you know exactly what that interview is about. And you know that potentially there's something in there that you as a researcher want to dig into and explore more deeply. And I think that is the best combination. But the reality is, what's making that work is the textualization. It's textualizing the audio that gets that in the first place. Transcription has always done that. And I think I do get sort of bad reputation here from the transcribers who say that, you know, I'm encouraging people not to transcribe. We're trying to actually pivot at my center to get as much of our indexed only interviews that are now currently online transcribed as well, because I really do believe that is one of the more perfect ways to present oral history, because different people's brains work very differently, and so there are people who are going to where the reading is going to be more effective. There's no doubt that transcription provides you much more text from a search and discovery perspective. Almost too much when you have 17,000 interviews and you have all of your interviews full text searchable. But transcription is still an important thing in this process. But I've really shifted, and so much of oral history has focused its attention on transcription as the thing, because it is the thing that for so many years was the preferred way of interacting with the interview. You know, because even I was interacting with a history professor just this last weekend, and the history professor, we were given a sort of presentation together, and I was talking about ohms and indexing, and she was just like, I still want to copy and paste the passage into, you're still making me type the transcript for the passage that I want to quote. I want a transcript. And I was like, yeah, okay, I hear you. But I got you there. I got you to the point of finding the passage that you want. Can you, I'm just asking you to take that last step. But people really do like those transcripts. And I think, especially if you're talking about hearing impairment as a possibility as well, that's something to be mindful of as well, that I think if somebody can't physically listen to that interview, trying to make those interviews as accessible as possible is really, really important. So we are spending a great deal of time. And I guess the shift that I was going to say before I digress was I've really come to terms with the fact that the transcript to me is just metadata. It's searchable metadata. It's not the thing. The audio is the thing, but the transcript is what makes the thing searchable, and the index. But the transcript, I've really made that turn in my mind. It's just metadata. And when I've sort of made that turn, it really frees you up from a lot of things. This burden of absolute perfection that we've had with transcription is something that I think we're going to grapple with, because we see a lot of people out there now using speech recognition technologies. And if you've seen a lot of people who, you see captioning where clearly they didn't edit the caption before it went out for publication, Zoom captions in a on the fly basis. I don't know if we're doing that right now, but if we are, it's probably wildly wrong at places. And so if all you're interacting with is the text, you're going to get a potentially pretty serious misinterpretation or misrepresentation of my voice. But I think we're going to start to see oral histories out there where people are putting that text out there because it makes it searchable, but they're not going in and cleaning it up, because that takes a lot of time. That could, take 6.5 hours. We've measured our average is about 6.5 hours of cleanup per interview hour for automatic speech recognition. Now that's still, depending on who you're having do the cleanup, could be a lot cheaper and less expensive than doing the transcript alone. So we're starting to ramp up our operation, working with the speech recognition technologies a great deal. But I think the orality for me is really where there's great beauty, I think, and in listening, in speaking and listening, that analog, because even if it goes through a digital device, it's still an analog process, that sound wave coming into the ear and being interpreted by a human brain. I think that's still one of the most beautiful things there is in this world from a communication standpoint. So.
Thank you. No, I'm completely on with you on that. I have dozens more questions, but I think I should sort of, give others a chance. I did see a comment in the chat from Maya. Maya, if you're able to go ahead and, I'm not sure if things have been answered, but if you want to sort of.
Yeah, actually, Venkat, so if I can just, please don't mind me not switching on my camera.
Yeah,
But the question actually, comes from the mention of particular technology, right? So Omeka was incubated at George Mason I think OHMS at Kentucky, and many of these sort of very, very open, technologies have come from university spaces. And they're often used also by, university students, college students and such. The library support systems in the US are very robust. This is not the same story on the Indian side, but it's a very fundamental sort of I think, pillar that will support this work in the future. And this is both linked to the question of custodianship, right? So who is this third party? It's kind of weirdly like the data privacy question of, who is that sort of data authority or whatever. But who is that party that you really trust to like continually, let's say, seek consent, right? Not as a one-time thing, but continually, alongside also the sort of the umbrella under which people find things. So is this the provenance really of university academic kind of, that domain? Or in a sense, is it high time now, since knowledge is being democratized through these tools, that this go into this sort of other kind of public domain space, much beyond institutions we've ever imagined, state or academic or, National Endowment for the Humanities, whatever. So this is, I think, for Doug, because I think they've been in the university system in a very, I think it's very complementary, the way that work has kind of come out of their system. In our case, it's beginning. So let's see where it goes. But yeah.
That's a great observation. And I think there are definitely like cycles. And I think a lot of that innovation is coming out of space where people are actually rewarded for experimentation and such in a non-commercial way. And so that's the beauty, I think, of having sort of academic institutions that are kind of driving some of that. But there really does have to be a point where the shift occurs, and that shift is actually happening right now with me. I mean, one of my great fears that keeps me up at night, I've got 62 different countries with several thousand institutions or whatever using OHMS. What happens if I just walk away from it all? What happens if, my center is not just me, but at some point I really have been the driving force behind OHMS completely. And so that has kept me up. And there's this idea of sustainability. Now I know Omeka has sort of shifted away from George Mason when sort of the person who was the driver for that left that position and went to Michigan State, I think is where she is now. And so, and so I don't want OHMS to be a gate that requires me. And so we have actually been in the process, as we speak, of rewriting the entire OHMS code. We have partnered with a vendor who has been the vendor that I have used to develop OHMS, but it's also a vendor who actually hosts a wonderful, amazing repository infrastructure called Aviary for audio and visual materials. So they have been not secretly, but the developer behind the scenes that we've been using for OHMS for the last 6 or 7 years. And so it just kind of hit me at one point. We've got to find a way to make this tool sustainable without me. And so we've created a partnership. We're rewriting the entire code, and we're integrating OHMS into infrastructure that's going to be far more sustainable over the long haul. It will still be free. Aviary is a commercial product, but OHMS will be a free portion of that. And that's going to help me sleep a little bit better now, I think, knowing that it's going to be freely available. It's also going to be something that finally is going to be something that will be on the open source market. What I mean by that, we've always talked about OHMS being open source and free, but that's not completely true in the sense that the viewer was open source and free. So you still have to do your work in a central cloud hosted location because OHMS is a web app hosted by the University of Kentucky. Now that creates some problems when we talk about, say, like GDPR issues in the EU. Well, yeah, and I think with regard to those issues, where there's some governments who say state entity cannot use put data on servers that aren't hosted in our country, and so so this transition is really going to allow us to have a version of OHMS, the application, where you do all your work, to be something that you could potentially host on your servers somewhere with your institution. And that's going to be really, that's the thing that I'm probably most excited about, is that that's truly going to potentially democratize the technology, is that no longer will you have to just use our servers and our infrastructure and be dependent on that to prepare your material. I never wanted you to necessarily keep everything on there. You just use it as a place to prepare it and then push it off to where you want to present it, which is where the OHMS viewer comes into play. But I think the point is, we're moving in a direction, I think that's the maturing of the tool, that it's kind of moving into adulthood, I think, and it's going to continue to be freely available, but it's also something that could be even more available to you in a more sustainable way, because it's not sustainable to just have it built completely around me and have my center funding the entire operation. Now it's also built around where there's a serious group of people here in the United States who want OHMS to work in languages that are right to left. So Yiddish, for example, Arabic, and there's been a lot of interest in that. But that's not something that the Nunn Center can necessarily pay for, because we don't have any Yiddish material or Arabic material. But now somebody can kind of swoop in and say, we would like to add this to OHMS, and work with those developers and make that happen. And that I think is really opening up a new exciting phase, I think, for us. So, but a lot of the innovations happening in the academic world, but I think what's happening from, your question about custodialship is really interesting too, because that opens up this whole question of like institutional ownership, shared authority with communities, but that also opens the door up from a preservation standpoint too, because I really like the fact that there's an institution who's there when somebody says 15 years later, I want my interview taken down. And if this were just some sort of community website with very little curation, there might not be that person, I think, to do that. And so I'm seeing a lot of these kind of aggregated archives out there that are doing that. And so that's kind of the only point where I push back on like Creative Commons licensing, which is technically irrevocable, or this sort of this idea that the community archive potentially is the only arbiter of that information, because the community archive could be abandoned and that person's story be abandoned. And so I do still I love the idea of partnering with communities and figuring out important ways of collaborating from a custodial standpoint. But that's something that I also grapple with, is because we're 50 years old and we know what happens, that interviews do last 50 years and have this afterlife, and who's going to be responsible for them if everything's just on the web and nobody's really paying attention from a curatorial standpoint. So I think about the custodialship question a lot right now, and that's another frontier I think that we're going to need to start to work out from that perspective. From every other perspective, the community archive is an amazing thing. I just get really freaked out about the long-term 50, 60, 70-year arc.
Many thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks. Nandini, who is also the president of the association, Doug, had a question. Nandini, are you able to unmute and ask? Or should I ask this for you?
It'll be good if you could ask.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just voice it out, because there's some people watching.
My sound is not very nice. It's going and coming. So if you could ask, please.
Sure, I'll do it. And this is also for the benefit of people watching on YouTube, Doug. So Nandini asked, you'd said many oral history centers just went away. I'm not sure. So, but could you sort of share some context as to what was going on?
Sure. In the 1970s, when the popularity hit, a lot of people just declared they had a center, and what that center really was one person who was really actively interviewing. And so what you see a lot, and you still see, I think, happening in academic institutions and public history institutions, is is when the one person who's driving the impulse retires and their position doesn't get filled by that department, that center would go away. And so there were a lot of people who were really excited about oral history in the 1970s here in the United States who were doing that, maybe even made the turn and declared that we have an oral history center. But then when that person retired or stopped doing what they did or took a different job, it really wasn't something that was sustainable because it wasn't fully staffed or was, one of the things that was subject to budget cuts and things like that. So there was a lot, and some of them have reemerged. Like, for example, here in Kentucky, there were several that did go away in that scenario that I described, but one of them has come back in sort of digital form only. And so because of digital technologies like OHMS and Omeka, they've been able to kind of bring back this oral history center in the form of a digital collection that has then started to create new interview projects. So it's really been interesting to watch that unfold. But other ones just they went from being oral history centers that were interviewing to archival collections that never got digitized and just kind of went away from that perspective.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just jump in with a question. Of course, anyone else wants to ask, you can raise your hands and such. I just want to see if we can take a long-range view. I mean, we've been talking about, as I said right in the beginning, of the digital age over the last 30 years, perhaps. But when you see things going forward, I mean, one question I have was, how much have digital tools affected the craft of interviewing? I wonder if you're able to sort of take a shot at this over the last few decades and where you think it's going. And I mean, sometimes when I think about why I do an interview, one of the biggest things I find from that process is a process of building empathy in a broader sort of maybe utopian sense. And I'm just wondering, have tools aided that, inhibited that? Just curious to know what your thoughts are on this.
That's a great question. And I think there's a few things. There's a few different angles there. One angle is what I love is informed consent. I can send a potential interviewee, narrator, an example of how we provide access to interviews, and they can say, "Oh, wow, that's really great." Oh, and that way they have a really good sense for what's going to happen with their interview. I love that. From an actual interviewing standpoint, one thing that kind of haunts me a little bit, when I do an interviewing workshop, the thing that I say to everybody when I send people out to, learning to do oral history for the first time, I say, the most important questions that you're going to ask are the ones that are not on your page that you prepared for. They're going to be the follow-up questions and those beautiful digressions that you're going to follow along with. And that's where I say, it's not, the classical music model, it's jazz, that it's going to, there is an improv component to this interviewing art that we do that's really quite beautiful. And those are some of the most important moments to be open to that. What I'm afraid of with OHM's indexing in particular is the trend of interviewing to the index. I see the index now when I'm interviewing. Like I actually see the subject transition happening, and I can sense, I even have a sense of like what the title's gonna be and things like that. And so it's actually really strange for me when I actually conduct interviews, because I have this sort of hyper awareness of what it's going to look like from an indexing standpoint. Or I even caught myself at a moment being like, the thing that's going to make the index more beautiful here is if I ask this question versus that question. And I think, yes, I was the driving force behind creating OHMS, but I think this isn't just me as the person who created it. It's definitely something that I think if somebody has interacted a lot with indexes, is going to have an awareness of. And so from an interviewing standpoint, I do think that will have an impact. Now, whether that's a bad impact or not, I'm not sure, but I am fearful that it's going to want people to be more structured. So for example, indexing me, even though I have, I'm always all over the place. I really am. I don't know if anybody's noticed that, but I tend to jump around. I'm the easiest person in the world to index because when I'm about to do a major subject transition, every time I say, so, and then I pause for about 2 seconds, and then I ask my next question. And so all you have to do is listen for that so, and you know it's coming. Which is a digression again, but I think this idea of interviewing for the outcome is not the way I envision oral history. Your project should be designed around your outcomes. I'm absolutely supportive of that. But the individual interview, I do come from more sort of the Portellian camp of let's just explore this beautiful thing together and see where it takes us at times with a little bit more structure. But I think the OHM's index then potentially adds a whole nother level of rigidity potentially to and formality, I think, to an interview that could potentially have an impact. And there's also the privacy. There's also the privacy thing that, like, I think the general population, as they start to be more aware of privacy, I'm afraid that in general, that's back to the scary part of this thing that we're facing with this next transition into the new digital paradigm. I think is going to be, are people going to be curating their life stories in the same way that they potentially curate their social media? That it becomes, there's always been a sort of performative component of that, but on a deep level. But are we going to get more performance? We've talked about like story. I don't know if you're aware of like StoryCorps, but this morning on my way back from the swimming pool, this week's StoryCorps episode ran, and StoryCorps is this thing that's like these really short interviews that tend to have very poignant moments in them that are broadcast on National Public Radio, and they've been doing it for maybe 15, 16 years now. And they're always, they target the very powerful, beautiful, and this morning's was sort of a very stereotypical StoryCorps story that was this painful story about somebody who passed away from cancer far too young. Well, people wait in line to share their StoryCorps stories. StoryCorps now has like 50,000 interviews or something crazy, and they take a truck all over the country to set up in a community and do this. But people wait in line to tell their most powerful stories. And so there's almost like a feedback loop that's been created where what started out as collecting these really poignant stories is now people waiting in line to tell their most powerful story, potentially to get on the radio. And I'm speculating, but I think we might have a very similar thing in oral history where people are going in and they've always had agendas, but are we really going to get people who are like, having a more performative aspect to their interview because they know it's going to be accessed and they know it's going to be out there and they know it's going to have be listened to. And so they're going to change from the interviewee's side of things too, where the interviewee starts to change their story because of this technology and the knowledge that these digital tools exist. We're also getting more of people asking to take moments out, edit, because people are aware that we can do it. And so they'll say, hey, can you just take that story out from, and we don't like to do that and make it very difficult to actually do. But we've had to face that because so many people are now asking because they know we can do it because of their knowledge of the digital tools.
It's really fascinating you're saying this, actually, because I notice a similar trend also in, we also deal with paper records. So when I see some archival records, every now and then I'll look at a record and it'll occur to me that this person was very conscious of the archive that might be coming up. And so there's this, that sort of plays in where you're sort of conscious of the future. And so your present is very driven by how you think it will be. Anyway, it's just, so thanks for sharing that, Doug. I think we're almost out of time, so I'll have Indra's question, and then maybe we'll sort of wrap things up. Indra, go for it.
Thanks, Doug. That was really, you made me think so much, and it was, as usual, it was so very rich. And I'm just wondering, and we've been talking about this from the morning, that when we look at oral history as a practice, we are not real. I mean, it demands so many things from you. It just as you tell your students, like, this is not classical music but jazz, and there's an element of improvisation here. How do we train the oral historians of the future? Because there's technology, there's stuff that you must know about how you're going to save this interview. So there is a lot. So how do we really train students? Because one of my difficulties has been where very young students would turn around and say, I don't really know about the emergency. And and you say, oh, but you are interviewing someone who lived through it, so you have to find that out. And there is that moment when I feel that I'm expecting a lot from them, because they must know technology, but they must know contemporary history, their knowledge of the world. And so I'm just wondering how one goes about this.
Your question is so important right now, because at least here in the United States, oral history has been a term that's absolutely been co-opted by journalism. And so I don't know if anybody does Google alerts, but I've always had a Google alert on the phrase oral history. So when something new goes on the web, Google finds it, Google tells me that, hey, there's oral history. And it used to be just little things here and there, but it was a great way to sort of track what was happening, say, with, the Oral History Society and what Rob's doing and things like that. It was great to kind of have that. I get almost no genuine oral history from that Google alert anymore, because every journalist who does an interview with somebody about something that occurred in the past are titling their articles an oral history with, so-and-so. And it's really forced me to kind of start to think about the definition, and not just the definition, but defining what it is that we do, and differentiating what it is that we do and call oral history from this, and we've struggled with this for a long time. But I think it's something that is really important in terms of because there's a lot of conversation about, the popularity of oral history. My center has grown because interviewing methodology is expanding and accelerating, and people are excited about it. Not everybody calls it oral history, but the activities are really ramping up. But there's also this sort of an Alexander Freund's article years ago about StoryCorps and the sort of the neoliberal storytelling component of what,
Yes.
That I think is happening. So more people are kind of doing the interviewing things, and people are developing platforms for this. The platform that we have used for a lot of our remote interviews, Their Story is what it's called. Our remote interviews, it was actually created. It's like Zoom, but it was created for oral history. And so we're getting platforms that are now being created for remote oral history, so you can connect with your family. But I think there's a real danger in the ambiguities that oral history has really enjoyed, I think, in terms of the popularity of it. And I think that's something where I think we do need to emphasize the history aspect of this, the historical aspect or the ethnographic. But I think this sort of professionalization of what it is that we do is at risk of, because everybody's got a recorder in these things, and anybody can do an interview with somebody. And the rise in podcasts, where everybody's doing a lot of these interviewing based podcasts, are really fantastic, and I love them. Is it necessarily oral history in the sense of what it is that we do? Probably not. Is it something that's probably worth archiving? Is it something that is something that should fit under oral history's umbrella? Because it is a big umbrella, I think, with a lot of practitioners from a lot of different disciplines already. So I really grapple with that. And I think, here in the United States, we've started to graduate a lot of people from Columbia University's master's program in oral history, which is fantastic, but it's still Columbia University, which is a very elite institution, and not open to, somebody who doesn't have a really lot of money, I think, to spend on that, or is willing to go into a large amount of debt. And there's not a really great professional job field. So we're starting to see, I've always said this, that in some ways the most secure way to get into oral history is to go the archives route, because there is a job field that's still vibrant in the archives world. And I don't know a single archive who would say, no, we don't want you to do an oral history project that pertains to our archive. And so that's been really something that I've been pushing for a long time. But I think people who have gone the more traditional historical route, it's really hard to get a tenured track, university position as a historian now. And what I mean really hard, They're getting, 600 to 900 applicants for a single position. And the person I remember Cliff Kuhn, who used to direct the Oral History Association before he passed away. I remember he told me in Barcelona, at the International Oral History Association, he said, I'm on a search committee, and we just hired somebody, and the guy who wrote the book that was on the New York Times bestseller nonfiction list, it topped the New York Times bestseller list, he didn't get the job. And I was just like, it's so that's closing up. And so we have this contracting professional employment opportunities that are happening, that is really, I think, forcing this larger struggle. So we do have a lot of freelancers that are starting to bubble up into the United States ecosystem. I remember I went to do a keynote in Australia several years ago, and I was stunned by how many freelance oral historians were in Australia. And it was explained to me that we just don't have as many university jobs. There's a lot of people who are doing like an IT job at their university who also do oral history. And these freelancers were connected to the national communities through the professional organization. And that's how they connected to best practices. That's starting to happen in the United States, where we're starting to see a faster growing segment of the oral history population being these freelancers. And so I think this whole question of what is oral history really puts a heavy emphasis on the national organizations and the regional organizations to work as a network to really stay ahead of this notion of best practices, and be mindful of our definition and defining what it is that we do, and kind of accepting that and being confident with that. And, in a way that I think it's almost like we spent so much of our life trying to convince people we were, respectable in terms of a practice. And now everybody's doing it. How do we now convince, people that there is a professional way to do it that's really important, and there is a series of best practices, and a community of practice of professional practitioners, that's all very important. So I think that's going to be something that I think we're going to grapple with for sure. But I think it's really important what you're talking about, because we, Columbia University is turning out some really incredibly talented people at oral history who are incredibly knowledgeable. But I'm not sure, there was a job market for just, freelance oral historians in the beginning. It's not like that went away. There really were very few oral history jobs. That's why I left oral history and went to the University of Alabama. I felt like I had topped out and there were no more jobs and I wasn't going to get a job. So I left. And then the University of Kentucky job came open, and I pretty much was one of the few people uniquely qualified, I think, for that position. when it came open. But I think it's always been a very tight labor market, I think, in terms of oral history.
Absolutely.
And so that's where a lot of improvisation has to happen as well. But when you have that, and you're open to all these different, I love the fact my PhD is in folklore. I love the fact that I can call myself an oral historian, but have this broad, background, and that we don't have these rigid walls that keep people out. At the same time, I think we're going to really struggle with a problem with definition and kind of defining what it is that we do. And a lot of it is journalism, I think, but a lot of it is just this wild popularity of interviewing. And is it useful to have everything that has an interview about something in the past be called oral history?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Indira. Thanks, everyone, for being here. There's so many more questions that I could ask you, Doug, but I think we're going to have to figure out a way to invite you to India for that one. Because there is quite a bit. But I mean, to the extent of what you asked, what is this all about? I suppose, the one thing that for me indexing does and what the digital work has done is to do two things. One is to help us listen better. And the second is to, annotate it or open doors. So for me, every annotation is opening a door to the object and saying, here's another way of looking at this. And so for those two things, I'm very grateful for what these tools have offered us over the last many years. And hopefully we're able to get more people to do that. So thank you. Thanks for making us listen. And hopefully we'll be able to have you over here soon.
I'm counting on it.
All right. Brenda, I guess we could stop the live YouTube thing. And thanks everyone for being here.
Yes, we'll do that.
Thanks for having me. Really, it's an honor.
Yeah. There was a